Now that we've worked through self-directed learning and self-blended learning, let's get to the nuts and bolts. Let's talk about the classroom experience. So self-directed learning can happen in homeschool environments, it can happen outside of school, it can happen in school. But if a student is in a traditional school and we want to embrace self-blended learning and self-directed learning, it has to impact what happens in the classroom. So how do we create a self-blended, friendly classroom? Let's talk about that a little bit. So it starts with something that I talked about in the last video, which is a self-blended friendly classroom is one where the teacher understands the role and the value of self-directed learning, where the teacher has worked through some of the concerns and the fears of letting go and playing a different role of coach and mentor and inviting the students into the planning process. But a key part of becoming a self-blended friendly classroom has to do with the teacher taking the lesson plan and putting it in front of the students. So sometimes self-blended learning, you still have things that you have to accomplish, or certain learning objectives, certain standards that you have to meet, or something like that. So one great way to get started with self-blended learning is to share in advance your lesson with the students and invite the students to have input on what happens. So a typical lesson plan answers a series of questions. What do I want the students to know? How will I help them learn it? How will I know when they've learned it? And how do I make sure they have frequent and meaningful feedback along the way? In essence, you can invite students to evaluate each of those 4 questions in the lessons in your classroom. Invite them to have some input. So the first question, what do I need them to know? Alongside that, you can also invite the students to establish some of their own personal or group goals. What do we want to learn? What do we want to learn alongside these other things? A second thing that you can do in the self-blended friendly classroom is to invite students into figuring out how to learn it. So you're going to have some plans. Maybe you have assigned readings or course activities, but also why not invite the students into brainstorming together? If we could do anything to learn this, what would be the absolute best way for us to meet this learning goal, to learn this? Invite the students into dreaming. And it's kind of fun. So an analogy that I often give is, let's imagine that you're preparing the next generation of neurosurgeons. And you want to try to equip people to conduct brain surgery in a way that removes a tumor and the patient survives. What is the absolute best way to learn how to do that? Absolute best way, most effective way. Well, I would suggest that it's probably to find people with brain tumors, bring them into the classroom, and let students conduct surgeries on them over and over until they get it right. Obviously, we have an ethical problem here. We don't want to lose tons of people's lives while students are experimenting, right? So that's not realistic. But that's our dream, that's our idea. So let's step down, let's go down a step. What's the next best way that we could learn to do brain surgery and remove tumors? Maybe it's observing live people conducting surgery with a person who's pointing out exactly what's happening and how it's happening, and then you get to try it out in a simulated environment. Maybe it's not on a real patient, but it's on some kind of machine or some kind of technology that simulates a brain, and you're actually able to kind of go through the process. Well, maybe that's not realistic either because you don't have the resources. So you get the idea though. You start stepping down and you try to stay with the most realistic, the absolute best and most authentic learning experience that could help you learn and achieve this learning goal. Invite the students into that brainstorm, into that exploration. So your goal is to really invite the students into this conversation about what is the most authentic and effective way for us to learn this. And why not throw in the word fun and engaging? Let the students join you in the creation of the learning experiences. Because if you have a class of 20, I guarantee you, the ideas of 21 will be far more effective and you'll come up with far more creative ideas than even the best single teacher. So invite those young creative minds to help you figure out how we're going to get there and how we're going to monitor our progress and how we're going to have feedback. What kind of resources that we can use. All of those questions. You can simply turn that back to the students and invite them to have some say. Now at first and in most classrooms, you're not giving the students all the say, but you're giving them a little more voice and choice than they had before. And over time, you can gradually increase the amount of voice and choice that you give students, empowering them with growing levels of confidence and competence as self-blended and self-directed learners. Send the students, put them into research teams, and send them to go out in advance of a unit and figure out creative resources and ways that they could learn something. Have them bring that back. There was one example of a teacher who was teaching social studies, and he decided we're not going to use a social studies textbook. Instead, we're going to actually write a textbook together. And the students collectively started to figure out all these things about history as they wrote the text to be used by someone else. And they did it in the form of a wiki. That's a great example of how to embrace self-blended and self-directed learning. The students found themselves going out and interviewing experts. They interviewed professors of different areas of history that they were going to include that year. They found great resources, and they learned to analyze them and review them and to fact-check them. And they started discovering all these great things that fit perfectly with the spirit of self-blended learning. And that's what you can do in the self-blended friendly classroom. Another great strategy is to go back to what I've talked about in the past, which is the idea of a personal learning network, and to invite each student to create a log of the people and the resources and the technologies that they use to learn new things. It's kind of a learning journal or diary, but they're tracking who they go to for what and how helpful it was. And as they go through that, they become more thoughtful and more deliberate, more intentional about kind of owning the process of learning something new. And I'll give you just one more for the sake of this video. A great thing to do is to get a hold of one or more of the templates that are available out there. And I have 4 available on my blog that are templates that students can fill out to design their first personalized learning project or their first self-directed learning project. They usually answer the kinds of questions that I've shared before. What do I want to learn? How am I going to learn it? How do I make sure I have frequent, meaningful feedback along the way? How will I show what I've learned at the end? And there are different kinds of learning contracts and documents like this. And you can have students do these in small groups or individually. And once they go through this process 2 or 3 or 4 times, if you're giving them enough feedback and you're inviting students to give one another feedback, now you have something powerful starting to happen. These are a few of the many ways that you can go about creating a self-blended learning classroom. But it comes back to the one I started with, which is about the teacher's mindset and openness to it. What we really need are teachers who are going to say self-blended learning is important, and I'm going to welcome and embrace it in my classroom.